In the late 1930s, Greece occupied a precarious position on the southeastern edge of Europe. The country, emerging from the political turmoil of the interwar years, faced a mixture of internal instability and external pressure. Since the end of the First World War, Greece had engaged in several conflicts that shaped its national outlook. The Asia Minor campaign of 1919-1922 had ended in disaster, leaving deep scars in Greek society, including the arrival of over 1 million refugees from Anatolia. The political landscape remained polarized between monarchists and republicans, with governments changing frequently throughout the interwar decades. By 1936, General Ioannis Metaxas had established an authoritarian regime, suspending parliamentary politics and imposing strict censorship and control. This system, sometimes referred to as the 4th of August regime, emphasized stability, discipline, and the avoidance of external entanglements, though it was still tied to traditional Western alliances. Strategically, Greece's location was of major importance. Control of its territory meant access to the Aegean Sea, influence over shipping routes through the eastern Mediterranean, and potential air and naval bases that could affect operations in the Balkans and the Middle East. For Italy, under Benito Mussolini, Greece was seen as a natural extension of Rome's influence in the Adriatic and eastern Mediterranean. Italian forces had already occupied the Dodecanese Islands after the First World War, and Mussolini's ambitions included the establishment of a wider Mare Nostrum. For Germany, under Adolf Hitler, the Balkans were not initially a central focus, but the security of its southern flank and the safeguarding of resources such as Romanian oil gradually increased in importance. Both Axis powers recognized Greece as a strategic prize, although their motivations and priorities were not identical. On the Allied side, Britain maintained long-standing ties with Greece, seeing it as part of the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy relied on secure sea lanes through the region, especially once Italy entered the war in June 1940. London's policymakers understood that Greece's alignment or resistance could directly affect the defense of Egypt, the Suez Canal, and routes to India. At the same time, British military resources were stretched thin, and its commitments in North Africa, the Middle East, and at home limited the scale of aid that could realistically be provided. Nevertheless, Britain viewed Greece as an important partner, not least because the Greek armed forces, though modest, had undergone modernization in the 1930s with improvements in artillery, small arms, and aircraft procurement. Greek military preparedness in 1940 remained uneven. The Hellenic army could mobilize roughly 43,000 men, organized into divisions equipped with a mixture of older and newer weaponry. Much of its artillery dated from the First World War, though some more modern pieces had been imported from France and Czechoslovakia. The Air Force fielded a small number of fighters and bombers, including British-made Gloucester Gladiators and French Potez aircraft, but it was far inferior to the forces of Italy. The Navy was likewise modest, with destroyers, submarines, and a few older capital ships. However, Greek officers had combat experience from earlier conflicts, and morale was shaped by a tradition of defending national independence against larger powers. Intelligence assessments within Greece suggested that, in the event of conflict, geography and mountainous terrain might provide defensive advantages, though sustaining a prolonged campaign against a modern mechanized force remained uncertain. The civilian population faced its own concerns. Greece was not self-sufficient in food production. It relied on imports of wheat and other staples. Economic strains from the global depression and subsequent trade disruptions left shortages even before the war expanded. Public sentiment toward the Axis was wary, especially given Italian provocations, including the sinking of the cruiser Elli at Tinos on 15 August 1940, an incident widely attributed to Italian torpedoes. At the same time, many Greeks hoped to avoid direct involvement in a wider war, remembering the hardships of the 1920s and 1930s. Political control under Metaxas limited open debate, but the population remained aware of regional tensions. In Rome, Mussolini sought to demonstrate Italian strength by launching independent campaigns, distinct from Germany's operations. His successes in Ethiopia in 1935-36 had encouraged further expansionist policies. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and later struck in Western Europe in 1940, Mussolini looked to the Balkans as a field for Italian action. Albania, already under Italian control since April 1939, provided a staging ground for possible aggression. By the summer of 1940, Italian divisions were concentrated along the Greek border, with plans for offensive operations being discussed at the highest levels. The Italian leadership calculated that Greece's forces would be unable to resist a determined attack, and that occupation could be achieved within weeks. Berlin's perspective was more cautious. Hitler had not included Greece in his immediate strategic priorities. However, he recognized that Italian moves in the Balkans might trigger wider instability. German planners monitored British activities in the region, aware that the Royal Navy could establish bases in Greece to threaten Axis shipping and resource flows. For this reason, even before hostilities reached Greece, the country had already become a point of intersection between larger powers' interests, each weighing the risks and benefits of involvement. As the European War expanded in 1940, Greece stood at the crossroads of competing strategies. Its leadership sought to preserve neutrality, maintaining a delicate balance between Axis pressures and Allied appeals. Yet the country's geography, its resources, and its symbolic value ensured that neutrality would prove fragile. By the autumn of that year, decisions taken in Rome and Berlin, alongside responses in Athens and London, would set the stage for the next phase, the entry of Greece into the war and the consequences that followed for both its people and its territory. On 28th of October 1940, Italian Ambassador Emanuele Grazzi presented Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas with an ultimatum in Athens, demanding that Italian forces be allowed to occupy strategic positions on Greek territory. The ultimatum, delivered in the early hours of the morning, allowed only a few hours for response. Metaxas rejected the demand, reportedly using the phrase, "Alors c'est la guerre," and by dawn, Italian troops advanced from Albania into northwestern Greece. The opening of hostilities marked the end of Greek neutrality and the beginning of a campaign that would have consequences far beyond the Balkans. Italy committed approximately 14,000 troops to the initial invasion, organized into several corps supported by artillery and aircraft. The Albanian base of operations gave the Italians direct access to Epirus, a mountainous region where infrastructure was sparse and weather conditions harsh. Italian forces expected limited resistance and anticipated a rapid occupation of key towns. The Regia Aeronautica launched bombing raids on Greek cities and military positions, targeting communication centers and ports. In contrast, the Greek mobilization order called up hundreds of thousands of reservists. Within days, more than 300,000 men were under arms, moving toward the front despite logistical difficulties. The first clashes occurred in the rugged Pindus Mountains. Italian columns advanced through narrow valleys and mountain passes, seeking to break Greek defensive lines. The terrain, however, favored the defenders. Greek units, often familiar with the local landscape, made effective use of fortifications and natural obstacles. Despite being outnumbered in aircraft and mechanized units, the Hellenic army managed to slow Italian advances. The Battle of Pindus, fought in late October and early November, saw Greek forces halt and then push back elements of the Italian Julia Alpine Division, which suffered heavy casualties and was forced into retreat. This early success bolstered Greek morale and undermined Italian expectations of a swift victory. Civilian populations were directly affected by the opening battles. Villages near the front line faced bombardment, requisition of supplies, and displacement. Refugees moved deeper into Greek territory as the front shifted. In Athens, the news of resistance was met with a surge of public enthusiasm, though shortages of fuel, food, and medical supplies soon became pressing. Italian bombers targeted Piraeus and other ports, damaging infrastructure and disrupting trade. Nevertheless, the sense of national mobilization was widespread, as communities organized to support the army with clothing, food parcels, and volunteer medical services. British involvement began to manifest almost immediately. The Royal Navy increased patrols in the Aegean, escorting convoys carrying supplies to Greece. The RAF dispatched squadrons of aircraft, including Hurricanes and Blenheim bombers, to Greek airfields. Though their numbers were limited, these reinforcements contributed to defensive operations and raids against Italian positions in Albania. British commanders understood that Greek resistance tied down significant Italian forces that might otherwise have been deployed in North Africa, where fighting against British Commonwealth troops intensified during the same period. However, the extent of aid was constrained by commitments elsewhere. For the Italians, setbacks in November 1940 required reinforcement. Mussolini ordered additional divisions into Albania, raising the strength of his forces to more than 25,000 men by the end of the year. Yet the terrain and weather worked against them. Heavy autumn rains turned mountain roads into mud, complicating supply lines. Winter conditions soon set in, with snow and freezing temperatures affecting both armies. Greek troops, operating closer to their base areas, managed to maintain momentum. By late November, Greek counteroffensives pushed across the border into southern Albania, capturing towns such as Korça. This reversal represented not only a tactical victory, but also a symbolic moment, as Greece became the first allied nation in Europe to repel an Axis invasion. From the Italian perspective, the campaign in Greece was proving unexpectedly costly. Casualty figures mounted, with tens of thousands of men killed, wounded, or incapacitated by disease and exposure. Logistics required constant reinforcement, stretching Italian resources at a time when operations in North Africa also demanded attention. German observers noted the difficulties faced by their ally, raising concerns in Berlin about the potential consequences for Axis strategy in the Balkans. The possibility of British bases in Greece, combined with Italian failures, began to draw German attention toward intervention. The opening phase of the Greco Italian War, therefore, defied expectations. Italy's plan for rapid conquest turned into a protracted campaign, while Greece, though materially weaker, demonstrated resilience and tactical success in the early battles. The winter of 1940-41 would see the conflict deepen, with both sides preparing for further offensives, and with outside powers increasingly drawn into the struggle. By December 1940, the Greco-Italian War had entered a phase of strategic recalibration. The initial Italian offensive had failed to achieve its objectives, and Greek forces had not only secured their territory, but advanced into southern Albania. This shift required both sides to reassess their goals and resources. For Greece, the counteroffensive represented an opportunity to push Italian forces further back, safeguard vulnerable regions, and possibly strengthen its diplomatic position. For Italy, the situation created a pressing need to regain the initiative, salvage prestige, and stabilize its front before German intervention became unavoidable. The Greek General Staff, under Alexandros Papagos, reorganized the army into field commands operating along different sectors of the front. By early December, Greece had mobilized more than 43,000 men, effectively utilizing its manpower reserves despite limitations in equipment and logistics. The Hellenic army advanced on multiple axes into Albanian territory, targeting the cities of Gjirokastër, Tepelene, and Berat. Supplies were transported along mountain roads often unsuitable for heavy vehicles, with mules and pack animals forming the backbone of the logistical system. Harsh winter conditions slowed operations, but Greek troops, accustomed to mountainous terrain, retained a relative advantage. The Italian High Command responded with reinforcements. By January 1941, more than 28 divisions, including blackshirt units and Alpini formations, were deployed in Albania. Mussolini personally visited the front in an effort to rally morale and demonstrate his commitment. Yet the concentration of forces strained supply networks through the port of Durrës and the limited Albanian infrastructure. Fuel shortages, insufficient winter clothing, and inadequate shelter undermined combat effectiveness. Italian air superiority, initially expected to dominate, was challenged by determined Greek resistance and the arrival of British and Commonwealth aircraft. The Royal Air Force increased its presence in the theater, stationing squadrons in Greece to support ground operations and protect shipping lanes. Hurricanes, Gladiators, and Blenheim bombers conducted missions against Italian positions and supply depots, while also defending Greek cities from bombing raids. British commanders recognized that Greece could not be fully supplied or defended, given the wider demands of the war. But the symbolic and strategic importance of aiding a resisting European nation was considerable. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy intensified patrols in the Ionian and Aegean seas, engaging Italian convoys and reducing their capacity to sustain the front. Greek advances in the winter of 1940-41 were steady but costly. The capture of the Korcia Plateau provided a strategic foothold, but further progress toward the port of Vlora stalled amid strong Italian defenses. Casualties mounted, and shortages of artillery ammunition and modern weapons became critical. By February, Greek forces had reached their practical limit of expansion. The extended front lines, stretching across mountainous terrain and harsh weather, required constant reinforcement. Epidemics of frostbite, dysentery, and typhus weakened units, while civilian populations in occupied Albanian towns faced requisition and disruption. Internationally, the Greek successes attracted attention. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill praised the campaign as a rare example of effective resistance against the Axis on the European continent. In Berlin, however, the situation was viewed with growing concern. German planners feared that British forces might establish bases in Greece, from which they could launch air operations against Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, vital to the German war effort. Reports from the Balkans indicated that Italian failures threatened to destabilize the entire region, as Yugoslavia and Turkey reconsidered their positions under increasing pressure from both Axis and Allied diplomacy. Within Italy, Mussolini faced criticism from his generals and from within the fascist party. The failure to defeat Greece quickly undermined Italy's image as a military power. German leaders, including Hitler, expressed frustration that the Italian operation had drawn Allied attention to the Balkans and created conditions requiring German intervention. In January 1941, planning began for what became known as Operation Marita, the German campaign in Greece. The Wehrmacht prepared to move through Bulgaria into northern Greece, coordinated with a broader Balkan strategy that included the subjugation of Yugoslavia if necessary. The timetable for these operations was complicated by the German invasion of the Soviet Union, planned for later in the year, creating an additional layer of urgency. For the Greek civilian population, the winter months were increasingly difficult. Food shortages, rising prices, and the requisitioning of resources for the war efforts strained daily life. Refugees from Albania and Epirus placed further pressure on urban centers. Despite hardships, public morale remained strong, sustained by news of military advances and a sense of national unity. In Athens and Thessaloniki, demonstrations of support for the armed forces were frequent, though censorship limited the extent to which bad news reached the public. By March 1941, the conflict had reached a stalemate. Italian forces launched a major offensive, often referred to as the Spring Offensive, involving over 17 divisions along the central Albanian front. The attack, personally observed by Mussolini, failed to break Greek defenses. Despite heavy artillery bombardments and repeated infantry assaults, Greek lines held firm, inflicting high casualties. This final Italian effort to reverse the situation before German involvement ended in failure. The result reinforced Greek confidence, but simultaneously exhausted its capacity for prolonged resistance. The strategic balance was shifting. German forces massed in Bulgaria, preparing for coordinated operations in the Balkans. Diplomatic maneuvers in Belgrade and Ankara highlighted the uncertainty of neighboring states, but the momentum of Axis planning was clear. For Greece, the coming of spring would bring not only the continuation of its struggle against Italy, but also the opening of a new and far larger front. The campaign was about to move from a bilateral conflict into a multinational confrontation with consequences for the entire region. In early April 1941, the strategic situation in the Balkans transformed decisively. German forces, already concentrated in Romania for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, were ordered south into Bulgaria to prepare for intervention in Greece. The operation, codenamed Marita, was conceived not as a response to Greek resistance alone, but as a broader effort to secure the southern flank of the Axis alliance. The failure of Italian offensives had drawn British involvement, and Hitler judged it necessary to prevent the establishment of Allied air bases, from which Romania's oil fields could be threatened. Thus, What began as a bilateral conflict between Italy and Greece expanded into a multinational confrontation involving German, British, and Commonwealth forces. At the same time, events in Yugoslavia directly influenced German planning. On 25 March 1941, Yugoslavia had signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, only to face a military coup 2 days later that brought to power a government perceived as pro-British. Hitler immediately ordered the invasion of Yugoslavia, integrating it with the forthcoming campaign against Greece. The Wehrmacht prepared a two-pronged offensive, one thrust southward through Yugoslavia into northern Greece, and another from Bulgaria across the Greek border towards Salonika. The coordination of these operations was entrusted to Field Marshal Wilhelm List, commanding the German 12th Army, supported by Luftwaffe units under General Alexander Löhr. German forces assembled for the campaign included approximately 68,000 men, 1,200 tanks, and 700 aircraft, drawn from experienced formations that had participated in earlier victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans. Key units included the XL Panzer Corps with the 9th and 11th Panzer Divisions and the 68th Mountain Corps, supported by the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. In contrast, the Greek army, heavily committed to the Albanian front against Italy, had fewer than 2,000 men available in central and northern Greece. British reinforcements, arriving as part of what was called the W Force, under General Henry Maitland Wilson, added around 62,000 troops, including Australian and New Zealand divisions, but these were understrength and inadequately equipped for a rapid mechanized campaign. The terrain of northern Greece and southern Yugoslavia shaped operational planning. German strategists identified the Axios and Vardar valleys as natural corridors for armored thrusts, while mountain ranges along the Metaxas line posed challenges. The Metaxas line, a series of fortifications built along the Bulgarian frontier, consisted of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions designed for static defense. Though formidable on paper, it could not be fully manned, as the bulk of the Greek army was deployed in Epirus. Allied planners debated whether to hold forward positions along the border or to retreat to shorter defensive lines farther south. But political and psychological considerations led to a decision to resist at the frontier. On the 6th of April 1941, German forces launched their assault. Luftwaffe aircraft bombed airfields, communication centers, and transport hubs, gaining air superiority within days. In Yugoslavia, German armored spearheads quickly overran border defenses and advanced toward Belgrade, supported by Italian and Hungarian contingents. In Greece, the attack on the Metaxas line met determined resistance. Greek and British units defended fortresses such as Rupel and Parathori, with heavy casualties on both sides. Some fortifications held out for days, inflicting losses on German attackers, but bypass maneuvers by mountain divisions rendered many positions untenable. By 9th April, German units entered Salonika, effectively cutting off northern Greek forces from the rest of the country. The rapid collapse of Yugoslav resistance accelerated the German advance. Within 11 days, Belgrade had fallen and Yugoslavia capitulated. German divisions then turned their attention fully to Greece, exploiting breakthroughs and pressing southward. The British Expeditionary Force attempted to organize a defensive stand along the Ali Akman line, but outflanking maneuvers forced a withdrawal. Motorized German formations advanced at high speed, while Luftwaffe bombing raids harassed retreating Allied columns. Bridges and roads destroyed by engineers slowed progress but could not halt the mechanized thrusts. By mid-April, the front had shifted towards central Greece. Civilian populations in Macedonia and Thessaly witnessed the swift succession of armies. Bombing raids destroyed towns and rail lines, causing civilian casualties and dislocation. Refugees crowded into southern cities, seeking safety. Meanwhile, the Italian front in Albania remained active, with Greek forces still holding positions despite German breakthroughs elsewhere. The strategic imbalance, however, was now unmistakable. Greece faced not one, but two Axis powers, supported by vastly superior resources in men, armor, and aircraft. For the British, the intervention became a matter of balancing commitments. While reinforcing Greece symbolized support for a resisting ally, the military calculus grew increasingly unfavorable. Supplies arrived through Piraeus and other ports, but shipping was vulnerable to air attack. The loss of material during unloading further weakened the effort. As German forces advanced, the prospect of evacuation loomed, recalling the experiences of Dunkirk and Norway. By late April, British command prepared contingency plans to withdraw Commonwealth troops by sea. The opening engagements of April 1941 demonstrated the effectiveness of German combined arms doctrine, integrating fast-moving armored divisions with concentrated air power. For Greece, the simultaneous pressure of two fronts exceeded available capacity, despite determined resistance at many points. The campaign's outcome was not yet final, but the momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Axis, setting the stage for battles farther south and the eventual occupation of Athens. By mid-April 1941, the Greek campaign had entered its critical stage. German forces, having broken through in northern Greece and overrun Yugoslavia, pressed southward in a coordinated advance designed to secure Athens and the Peloponnese. The speed of their operations left little time for Allied forces to reorganize, while the Greek army, already committed against Italy in Epirus, could not redeploy effectively. What followed was a period of rapid escalation, as Allied units attempted successive defensive stands, while civilians bore the consequences of aerial bombardments, refugee flows, and collapsing infrastructure. The German 12th Army advanced along two main axes. The XL Panzer Corps moved through the Axios Valley toward Larissa, while the 68th Mountain Corps pressed through the Pindus and Olympus ranges. Luftwaffe units maintained air superiority, striking columns of retreating troops and disrupting supply convoys. By 16th of April, German units had reached the approaches to Mount Olympus, where Australian and New Zealand divisions of W Force attempted to hold defensive positions. The terrain provided natural barriers, and for several days fierce fighting took place as Allied troops sought to delay the advance. Casualties were heavy, but German pressure, coupled with the risk of encirclement, forced another withdrawal. The Greek army faced parallel challenges. Approximately 15 divisions remained engaged against Italian forces in Albania, where offensive operations had stalled during the winter. These formations, cut off from central Greece by the German breakthrough, faced the choice of retreat through mountainous terrain or continued resistance against superior numbers. Communication breakdowns, shortages of ammunition, and exhaustion limited their capacity to maneuver. Despite valiant resistance in sectors such as Epirus, the Greek High Command recognized that the situation was untenable. On 20th April, General Georgios Tsolakoglu, commanding in Epirus, initiated negotiations with the Germans, resulting in a surrender agreement that formalized the capitulation of the main Greek field army on the Albanian front. For the British and Commonwealth forces, the strategic focus shifted to delaying actions and evacuation planning. General Wilson redeployed W Force along successive defensive lines, first at Thermopylae, then farther south near Thebes, in an attempt to buy time for withdrawal. These positions were chosen for their historical and geographical significance, narrow passes that restricted armored movement. Yet, German tactics combined frontal pressure with flanking maneuvers, forcing retreats before defenses could be fully consolidated. Air attacks on Greek and Allied positions intensified, with Piraeus and other ports suffering extensive bombing that destroyed fuel reserves, ammunition stockpiles, and civilian housing. Evacuation operations began in earnest in late April. The Royal Navy organized a series of convoys to remove Allied troops from southern ports, including Kalamata, Nafplion, and Monemvasia. Between 24 and 29 of April, more than 5,000 men were successfully evacuated, though thousands were left behind and taken prisoner. Naval losses included transports and destroyers sunk by German aircraft, while the Luftwaffe inflicted significant casualties on ships and embarkation points. The evacuation resembled earlier operations in Norway and Dunkirk, though on a smaller scale, with similar scenes of urgency, overcrowded beaches, and hasty departures under fire. The entry of German forces into Athens on 27 April 1941 marked the symbolic end of organized resistance in mainland Greece. The swastika was raised over the Acropolis, signaling the beginning of occupation. For many Athenians, the arrival of German columns was witnessed in silence, following days of aerial bombardment and shortages. British and Commonwealth troops that had not been evacuated were captured, joining tens of thousands of Greek soldiers already in captivity. Meanwhile, German commanders prepared to extend operations to Crete, recognizing the island's importance as a potential Allied base in the eastern Mediterranean. Italian participation during this period was limited largely to the Albanian front, where their forces advanced after Greek capitulation. Although the Germans had carried the main burden of the campaign, Mussolini sought to secure territorial gains and political influence in occupied Greece. Bulgarian troops also entered northern territories, occupying Thrace and eastern Macedonia, motivated by irredentist claims dating back to the Balkan Wars. Thus, the dismemberment of Greek sovereignty was carried out not by a single power, but by multiple Axis partners, each pursuing its own objectives. Civilian populations faced immediate consequences. Bombing raids had devastated key infrastructure, while agricultural disruption and requisitioning created shortages. Refugees who had fled battle zones now returned to ruined towns or sought shelter in cities already struggling with supply problems. The collapse of state authority created uncertainty as the occupying forces prepared administrative arrangements. For many Greeks, the transition from war to occupation came swiftly, leaving little time to adjust before new hardships emerged. Internationally, the fall of Greece was interpreted in different ways. In Berlin, it was celebrated as a rapid campaign demonstrating German military superiority, accomplished in less than a month. In Rome, Mussolini emphasized the restoration of Italian prestige, though observers noted that German intervention had been decisive. In London, the loss was acknowledged as a setback, but the evacuation preserved a significant portion of British and Commonwealth forces for future operations. Strategically, the Balkan campaign delayed the launch of Operation Barbarossa by several weeks, a factor that later acquired considerable historical significance. By the end of April 1941, the Greek mainland was fully under Axis control. The military phase had concluded, but the occupation was only beginning. The division of Greek territory among German, Italian, and Bulgarian authorities set the stage for new dynamics: administrative exploitation, collaboration, and resistance. The famine that would devastate Athens, the reprisals that would strike rural villages, and the emergence of one of Europe's most determined resistance movements were the consequences of the new order established in the aftermath of the campaign. The occupation of Greece, beginning in late April 1941, reshaped the country's political, economic, and social life. The Axis division of territory reflected both strategic considerations and long-standing ambitions. Germany retained control of strategically vital areas, including Athens, Thessaloniki, Crete after May 1941, and key communication lines. Italy assumed responsibility for the bulk of the country, governing much of the Peloponnese, the islands, and western mainland regions. Bulgaria annexed eastern Macedonia and western Thrace, fulfilling territorial aims it had pursued since the Balkan Wars. This tripartite division created overlapping authorities, differing policies, and complex interactions with the Greek population. German priorities centered on military logistics. Control of ports, airfields, and transport routes ensured that the eastern Mediterranean remained secure for Axis operations. Crete, captured in May 1941 after a major airborne assault, provided a crucial base for Luftwaffe and naval deployments. German garrisons in Athens and Thessaloniki guarded communication lines to the Balkans and beyond. Administration in these areas was strict, with security services focusing on suppressing dissent, maintaining order, and securing resources for the Wehrmacht. Repression was systematic, with executions and collective punishments used against suspected resistance. Italian occupation zones were larger, but less effectively controlled. Italian troops, numbering more than 25,000 at their peak, were responsible for policing vast rural areas. Their approach oscillated between attempts at cooperation with local authorities and harsh reprisals when resistance increased. Italian commanders often complained of logistical difficulties, low morale, and lack of coordination with German forces. In some regions, Italian officers relied heavily on requisitioning food and supplies, which contributed to worsening shortages. The occupation stretched Italian resources thin, and friction with German authorities grew over jurisdiction and policy. Bulgarian occupation policies in eastern Macedonia and Thrace were distinct. Bulgarian authorities pursued a program of annexation, imposing their language, administration, and settlement policies. Greek officials were dismissed, and Bulgarian settlers were encouraged to move into the region. Resistance to these measures was widespread, with reports of deportations and executions. The demographic and cultural transformation of these regions reflected Sofia's long-term objectives, but it also intensified resentment among the local population, fueling clandestine opposition. The economic consequences of occupation were immediate and severe. Axis authorities requisitioned food, raw materials, and industrial output for their own use. Greece's merchant fleet, one of the largest in Europe before the war, had been targeted and reduced by earlier German and Italian naval operations. Agricultural production declined as labor was diverted, livestock was seized, and transportation collapsed. By the winter of 1941-42, famine struck urban centers, most notably Athens and Piraeus. Estimates suggest that, at its height, tens of thousands died each month, with total famine deaths exceeding 100,000. Malnutrition and disease spread, exacerbated by inadequate medical supplies. Relief efforts, delayed by political considerations and naval blockades, began only after international pressure, with neutral organizations such as the International Red Cross facilitating limited shipments of food. Politically, the collapse of the Greek state created a vacuum filled by Axis-imposed administrations. A succession of collaborationist governments was installed, beginning with General Georgios Tsolakoglu, who had signed the surrender. These administrations operated under strict German oversight, with little real authority beyond implementing occupation policies. Attempts to maintain legitimacy were undermined by widespread perception of collaboration and inability to address the population's urgent needs. Political fragmentation deepened, with monarchists, republicans, communists, and other factions reorienting themselves under occupation conditions. Civilian life under occupation varied by region. In Athens, daily survival was dominated by food scarcity, curfews, and the presence of German troops. Black markets emerged as a critical means of subsistence, though prices were often prohibitive. In rural areas, conditions depended on local agricultural productivity and the intensity of Axis requisitioning. Villages near resistance strongholds faced repeated reprisals, including burnings and executions. Education and cultural life continued in limited forms, though censorship and propaganda sought to control public discourse. Radio broadcasts, posters, and controlled newspapers presented Axis narratives, emphasizing order and the inevitability of German victory. For the Allies, the loss of Greece represented both a military defeat and a propaganda challenge. British broadcasts highlighted Greek resistance during the campaign and emphasized the suffering of the civilian population under Axis occupation. Efforts to supply aid faced obstacles from Axis restrictions and naval warfare in the Mediterranean. At the same time, exiled Greek leaders, including King George II, and government officials who had fled to Egypt, sought to rally support and maintain international recognition. The exiled government aligned itself closely with Britain, laying the groundwork for future cooperation with Allied military planning. Axis control of Greece also carried wider strategic implications. The Mediterranean theater was affected by the need to garrison and supply the country. German paratroop losses in the conquest of Crete discouraged similar operations elsewhere, influencing planning for the Eastern Front. The diversion of resources to secure Greece contributed to delays in launching Operation Barbarossa. For Italy, occupation became a long-term burden, stretching military capacity at a time when campaigns in North Africa demanded reinforcement. For Bulgaria, annexation of Thrace and Macedonia brought temporary territorial gains, but also created enduring hostility with the Greek population. By the end of 1941, the occupation had created conditions of deprivation, repression, and instability across Greece. Yet within this environment, seeds of organized resistance began to emerge. Networks of former officers, political activists, and ordinary civilians started forming clandestine groups, distributing leaflets, sabotaging transport lines, and gathering intelligence for the Allies. The famine, the repression, and the fragmentation of authority ensured that resistance would not be limited to isolated acts, but would evolve into one of the largest and most determined movements in occupied Europe. By early 1942, the occupation of Greece had entered a new phase. The famine of the previous winter had revealed the limits of Axis administration and the fragility of the Greek economy under exploitation. At the same time, clandestine opposition began to grow into a coordinated resistance movement. The transformation from isolated acts of defiance into organized structures was gradual, shaped by ideological divisions, foreign influence, and local conditions. Within a year of the German invasion, Greece had become home to one of Europe's strongest resistance movements, marked by both cooperation and conflict among its factions. The earliest forms of resistance centered on intelligence gathering and sabotage. Small groups, often composed of former army officers or students, began transmitting information to the British Middle East Command through clandestine radios. Reports on German troop movements, naval traffic in the Aegean, and construction of fortifications were passed to Allied intelligence. Sabotage operations targeted railways, bridges, and communication lines, though at first on a modest scale. In September 1942, British Special Operations Executive (SOE) operatives parachuted into central Greece to coordinate with local groups. Their most famous success, the destruction of the Gorgopotamos railway bridge in November 1942, cut the main Axis supply line from Athens to Thessaloniki and was carried out jointly by two rival Greek resistance organizations. The major resistance groups crystallized during 1941-42. The National Liberation Front, EAM, established in September 1941, was closely linked to the Communist Party of Greece. Its military wing, the Greek People's Liberation Army, ELAS, grew rapidly, recruiting peasants, workers, and intellectuals, and by 1943 it numbered tens of thousands of fighters. ELAS operated primarily in rural and mountainous regions, using guerrilla tactics to harass Axis garrisons and disrupt transport. Parallel to EAM ELAS, the National Republican Greek League, EDES, founded by Colonel Napoleon Zervas, maintained a republican and anti-monarchist orientation, though less radical than EAM. EDES received significant British support and concentrated its activities in Epirus. A third group, the National and Social Liberation, EKKA, formed under Colonel Dimitrios Saros, operated on a smaller scale, advocating a moderate democratic platform. The coexistence of these groups was uneasy. While united in opposing Axis occupation, their political objectives differed sharply. EAM ELAS sought not only liberation, but also a transformation of post-war Greece along socialist lines. EDES and EKKA, by contrast, aimed to restore or reform democratic institutions without communist dominance. British liaison officers attempted to foster cooperation, recognizing that divided resistance weakened overall effectiveness. Operations such as the Gorgopotamos sabotage demonstrated that collaboration was possible, but ideological rivalry soon deepened, setting the stage for future internal conflict. The scale of resistance activity increased markedly in 1942-43. Partisan attacks disrupted Axis rail lines in Thessaly and Macedonia, ambushed convoys in mountainous terrain, and forced occupiers to devote thousands of troops to security duties. German and Italian garrisons responded with harsh reprisals. Entire villages were burned in retaliation for attacks, and mass executions were carried out as deterrents. In some regions, civilian hostages were taken and killed following partisan actions. The cycle of resistance and reprisal intensified, with each act of sabotage provoking greater repression, which in turn drove more civilians to support guerrilla forces. For the occupying powers, the resistance created serious military and political challenges. Italian troops, already stretched thin, often avoided leaving their garrisons except in large formations. German units, better equipped and more experienced, conducted major anti-partisan sweeps, but rarely achieved lasting success in mountainous terrain. Bulgarian forces in Macedonia, faced constant hostility, with clandestine networks maintaining contact across borders. The Axis also attempted to establish auxiliary forces composed of Greek collaborators, including local gendarmerie units and security battalions, to counterbalance the growing insurgency. Civilian participation extended beyond armed struggle. Underground newspapers circulated widely, breaking the monopoly of Axis propaganda. Secret schools and cultural associations preserved Greek identity under censorship. Clergy, teachers, and professionals contributed to clandestine networks, often at great personal risk. Women played crucial roles as couriers, organizers, and providers of shelter for partisans. The famine experience had already radicalized large segments of the population, making the promise of organized resistance more appealing than passive endurance. The international dimension of the resistance was also significant. From bases in Cairo, the British coordinated supply drops of arms, radios, and money to guerrilla groups. The SOE established contact points across Greece, using mountain villages as bases for liaison missions. Allied air forces conducted occasional raids on Axis positions, sometimes in cooperation with local partisans. Greek resistance also contributed to broader Allied strategy by tying down Axis divisions that might otherwise have been deployed on the Eastern Front or in North Africa. By 1943, tens of thousands of Axis troops were stationed in Greece primarily for security duties, reducing their availability elsewhere. However, unity among the resistance factions remained elusive. Clashes between ELAS and EDES began in late 1943, as each sought to assert dominance in liberated zones. These confrontations reflected not only local disputes, but also broader questions about the political future of Greece. British support often favored EDES, partly out of concern over communist influence, while Soviet signals to EAM encouraged persistence but avoided direct coordination. Thus, the resistance movement developed in parallel, as both a struggle against occupation and a contest over post-war power. By the close of 1942 and into 1943, resistance in Greece had transformed the nature of occupation. What began as scattered sabotage had become a broad-based movement involving tens of thousands of fighters and millions of civilians in networks of support. The Axis retained control of major cities and strategic routes, but large areas of the countryside effectively passed into partisan hands, creating a dual power situation. The occupation, once a military conquest, had turned into a war of attrition, with Greece emerging as one of the most active centers of resistance in Europe. By 1943, the balance of power within occupied Greece was beginning to shift. Axis forces still held the cities, ports, and strategic transport routes, but much of the mountainous countryside was increasingly dominated by partisan formations. German, Italian, and Bulgarian authorities recognized the growing challenge posed by the resistance and responded with intensified military operations, reprisals, and administrative measures. At the same time, the resistance factions themselves grew in strength, but also in rivalry, shaping both the military situation and the political future of Greece. The German command organized large-scale counterinsurgency campaigns aimed at breaking the hold of guerrillas over rural areas. Units such as the 117th Jaeger Division and the 1st Mountain Division were deployed to conduct sweeps through central and southern Greece. These operations typically involved encirclement of villages suspected of aiding partisans, searches for weapons, and destruction of property. Civilian reprisals became a central feature of occupation policy. Entire communities were subjected to executions and village burnings after partisan ambushes. Notable massacres included those at Distomo and Kalavryta in 1943, where hundreds of civilians were killed in retaliation for guerrilla actions. These operations inflicted heavy losses but failed to eliminate the insurgency, as partisans dispersed into rugged terrain and reassembled after Axis forces withdrew. The Italian presence in Greece was still substantial in early 1943, with more than 2,000 troops stationed in their occupation zones. However, morale was declining, supply shortages were acute, and relations with the population were hostile. Italian garrisons often relied on punitive expeditions to assert control, but struggled to suppress guerrilla activity. The armistice of Italy with the Allies in September 1943 transformed the situation dramatically. German forces moved swiftly to disarm Italian units in Greece, killing or capturing tens of thousands of soldiers. Some Italian troops joined the Greek partisans, or attempted to escape by sea, but most were interned. German control over former Italian zones extended the Wehrmacht's responsibilities, but also gave them direct oversight of almost the entire mainland. The Bulgarian occupation zone also faced continuous unrest. Policies of forced Bulgarization, including the banning of the Greek language and cultural institutions, provoked resistance both passive and armed. Local guerrilla bands in Macedonia intensified operations against Bulgarian forces, who responded with harsh crackdowns and deportations. These tensions reinforced divisions within the resistance, as nationalist elements prioritized opposition to Bulgarian annexation, while EAM ELAS emphasized broader social transformation and coordination against all Axis powers. The resistance movement itself expanded in numbers and scope. ELAS, under the political guidance of EAM, reached an estimated 5,000 fighters by the end of 1943, with influence across much of rural Greece. It established liberated zones where parallel administrations functioned, collecting taxes, running schools, and maintaining rudimentary justice systems. These areas, sometimes called Free Greece, represented a significant challenge to Axis authority. EDES, though smaller, maintained strongholds in Epirus with several thousand fighters, supported by British supplies and advisors. EKKA, while less numerous, held a symbolic role in central Greece. British SOE missions increased in number, parachuting supplies and coordinating operations with guerrillas, though they also tried to mediate growing tensions between factions. Allied strategy increasingly integrated Greek resistance into broader operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Sabotage missions against railways, ports, and airfields disrupted Axis supply lines to North Africa until the Axis defeat there in May 1943, and afterward hampered their defensive preparations in the Aegean. The destruction of the Aesopos railway bridge in 1943 mirrored earlier successes and demonstrated the continuing capacity of guerrillas to deliver significant blows. Intelligence provided by Greek networks contributed to Allied understanding of Axis deployments and readiness in the region. By forcing Germany to commit 5,000, 6,000 troops to garrison and anti-partisan duties in Greece, the resistance indirectly influenced the allocation of Axis resources on other fronts. Yet, alongside military successes, political divisions deepened. EAM ELAS, with its mass membership and control of liberated areas, increasingly positioned itself as the dominant resistance force. EDES and EKKA, backed by the British, resisted communist influence but could not match ELAS's scale. Skirmishes between partisans of different factions erupted, particularly after the Italian surrender created opportunities to seize abandoned arms and territory. In some cases, conflicts escalated into battles that rivaled those fought against Axis troops. British officers attempted to enforce unity under the Cairo-based Greek government in exile, but with limited success. The seeds of post-war conflict were clearly visible even as the struggle against occupation continued. For the civilian population, 1943 was a year of continued hardship. Food supplies remained scarce, and black markets flourished. Allied air raids against Axis shipping and facilities, though intended to weaken the occupiers, also caused destruction in port cities. Reprisals for partisan activity created a climate of fear, as entire villages faced annihilation after attacks on German convoys. Still, many communities chose to aid resistance groups, calculating that survival depended on solidarity rather than acquiescence. Women, in particular, played central roles as couriers, medics, and organizers within the networks that sustained the guerrilla armies. By the close of 1943, the occupation of Greece had evolved into a complex conflict. The Axis still held the cities and key routes, but large parts of the countryside were effectively under partisan administration. The resistance had grown into a significant military and political force. Though divided by ideology and competing visions for Greece's future, the Allies increasingly saw the Greek front as a useful distraction for Axis forces. though they remained cautious about committing major resources. The coming year would bring decisive developments as the global war turned against Germany, and the question of Greece's liberation and its political direction moved to the forefront. Something went wrong while generating the response. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. The liberation of Greece in 1944 brought an end to 3.5 years of Axis occupation, but it did not resolve the divisions and traumas that the occupation had created. The withdrawal of German forces, compelled by the advance of the Red Army in the Balkans and the mounting pressure of Allied operations, left behind a country devastated by famine, reprisals, and the destruction of its economy. Yet, it also left behind one of Europe's strongest resistance movements, deeply fractured along ideological lines, and a population facing both relief and uncertainty about the nation's political future. German withdrawal was gradual. By summer 1944, partisan activity, Allied bombing campaigns, and the collapse of Axis defenses elsewhere forced the Wehrmacht to begin evacuating positions in the Peloponnese and central Greece. In October 1944, German units abandoned Athens, retreating north through Macedonia into Yugoslavia. The capital was entered by Greek resistance fighters, soon followed by British troops who landed to oversee the transition. The raising of the Greek flag over the Acropolis symbolized the end of occupation. Yet the departure of the occupiers revealed the vacuum of power that had been building for years. The human cost of occupation was immense. Estimates suggest that more than 300,000 Greeks perished from famine, executions, and combat-related causes. Entire villages had been destroyed in retaliatory massacres, such as those at Kalavryta and Distomo. Infrastructure lay in ruins, bridges destroyed, railways sabotaged, and ports bombed. Agricultural production had collapsed, leaving urban populations dependent on irregular aid. The economy, drained by requisitioning and the collapse of trade, faced hyperinflation, with currency devalued to the point of near worthlessness. Families were scattered by deportations, imprisonment, or flight. Liberation, therefore, was accompanied by humanitarian crisis. Resistance movements emerged from the war both celebrated and divided. EAM ELAS, having become the largest and most organized force, controlled vast areas of liberated territory. Its political wing established local councils, courts, and administrative structures, projecting an image of an alternative government. EDES and EKKA, smaller but still active, held influence in particular regions and maintained close ties to the British-backed government in exile. During the occupation, the factions had occasionally cooperated, but by 1944, armed clashes between them had escalated, reflecting irreconcilable visions for post-war Greece. The liberation, therefore, immediately raised the question, who would govern? The British intervention aimed to stabilize the transition. Winston Churchill viewed Greece as strategically essential to maintaining influence in the eastern Mediterranean. British forces supported the return of King George II, although his presence remained controversial in a country divided between monarchist and republican loyalties. The Papandreou government, reinstalled from exile, sought to unify the political landscape, but relied heavily on Allied military presence. Tensions came to a head in December 1944, when demonstrations in Athens escalated into armed conflict between EAM ELAS and British-backed government forces. This confrontation, known as the Dekemvriana, marked the beginning of the open civil strife. The legacy of occupation was thus inseparable from the outbreak of the Greek Civil War. The experience of famine and repression had radicalized large parts of the population, who supported EAM's promise of a transformed social order. Others, weary of instability and wary of communist dominance, rallied to monarchist and republican factions aligned with Britain. The Axis occupation had unintentionally deepened ideological divisions that now shaped the post-war struggle. For many Greeks, the joy of liberation was overshadowed by the realization that peace was fragile and contested. On the international stage, the Greek resistance gained recognition as one of the most effective in Europe. Its sabotage operations, intelligence gathering, and harassment of Axis forces tied down tens of thousands of German and Italian troops, contributing indirectly to the broader Allied war effort. Yet, the political fragmentation of the resistance limited its ability to translate military success into unified national leadership. Greece's liberation underscored both the potential and the limits of resistance movements in shaping the post-war order. The famine of 1941-42, the reprisals of 1943, and the rivalries of 1944 became central memories in Greek society. Survivors carried the scars of hunger, executions, and displacement. Commemoration of resistance heroes coexisted with bitter accusations of collaboration and betrayal. In some villages, monuments honored partisans who fell in battle. In others, memories of massacres defined collective identity. The occupation period became a reference point in political discourse for decades, invoked by opposing factions to legitimize their positions. Historians continue to debate the long-term significance of the Axis occupation of Greece. Militarily, it delayed the German invasion of the Soviet Union by diverting forces to the Balkans. Economically, it devastated a region that would struggle with reconstruction for years. Politically, it transformed the Greek resistance into a powerful but divided movement, shaping the course of the Cold War in southeastern Europe. For ordinary Greeks, it was a period of survival under extreme conditions, where hunger, fear, and repression coexisted with resilience, solidarity, and defiance. The Greek tragedy of 1941-44 thus left a dual legacy. On one hand, it stands as a story of immense suffering under occupation, marked by famine, mass killings, and destruction. On the other, it represents the emergence of one of Europe's most extensive and determined resistance movements, which played a role both in the liberation of the country and in defining its turbulent political future. Liberation in 1944 closed one chapter of foreign occupation, but opened another of internal division, ensuring that the memory of those years would remain central to Greece's modern history.